encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. This is the Light Network.
Hello, and thanks for joining us today on the Why We Love Jesus podcast. This is a short weekly podcast where we sit down and we think about the person, the nature, the work of Jesus, and why we love him so very much. And today I want us to think about his perfection. His perfection. The New Testament is filled with references to the sinless perfection of Jesus. We'll cite a few and think about them together. 2 Corinthians 5:21, God made him, Christ, to be sin or to become sin for us, sin, the idea of a sin offering, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. So God made him, Jesus, to become sin for us who knew no sin. Translation, sinless. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15, we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in every point tempted as we are, yet without sin. Then you think about 1 Peter 2 and verse 22, who did no sin, neither was guile or deceit found in his mouth. Or 1 John chapter 3 and verse 5, there's an ethical exhortation when he says, in verse 5, you know that he appeared in order to take away sins, and in him there is no sin. And so when we think about Jesus, we think about absolute sinless perfection. Now that is absolutely astounding, because when we look at ourselves, we see, well, exactly the opposite. We have always known a world dominated by sin. We have struggled with sin. We have fought against it. We have obviously committed it, been in its clutches and its grasp, but yet Jesus was absolutely perfect. Now, when we look at these passages that deal with the perfection of Jesus, they also teach us something that's very important. First of all, in 1 Peter chapter 2, in verses 18 to 25, where we find 1 Peter 2:22, where Jesus committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth, that's in a context dealing with suffering. That Jesus, Peter's encouraging Christians when they're in difficult circumstances, that they would learn to suffer like Jesus. And it's where we get that famous statement, you remember, that Jesus is our example, right? He gave us an example that we should follow his steps. But what kind of an example? That's not just a generic life example, although Jesus is that for us, right? His perfect life shows us a model of what our lives should be. But in the context of 1 Peter chapter 2, it's about suffering. And when he suffered, he did no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth. And when he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten. He suffered perfectly. And so when we're dealing with his sinless nature, with his sinless perfection, even when it was tested at a great length of immense suffering and mistreatment, he remained perfect. Think about how challenging it is in difficult times to keep your head. Jesus was able to keep his head, to keep his heart the way that it was supposed to be, and to respond perfectly. So the perfection of Jesus teaches us how to suffer. But his perfection also, and I think primarily, teaches us about salvation. You see his sacrifice in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 21. God made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. He became the sin offering. He became the sin sacrifice. Now, if you remember the Old Testament, the sacrificial lamb in the Old Testament had to be perfect, without blemish and without spot. And this most likely is what Peter is referencing in 1 Peter chapter 1, saying that we weren't redeemed with corruptible things like silver and gold received from vain conversation or traditions from our fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. Looking at his perfection, Jesus in his perfection was what qualified him to be this sacrifice. Had he not been perfect, his sacrifice would not have been legitimate. But further, he is a substitute. His perfection is substituted for our imperfections, right? So God made him to be a sin offering for us who knew no sin, that in him we might become the righteousness of God. That is, Jesus took the treatment that you and I deserved, and we enjoy the treatment that he rightly deserved. And as such, it allows him then to also serve us as we continue this Christian walk. Hebrews 4 is set in a context of Christians who are in great difficulty. And he says, we have a high priest, and he's not like high priests that don't understand. He understands what it means to be human. He can sympathize with our weaknesses because he, in all points, he was tempted like we are, yet without sin. So he can serve us as our high priest. And that then, he says in verse 16, emboldens us to approach the throne of grace, to obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Jesus is concerned. His perfection is, yes, a sacrifice for us. It's a substitution, but it's also there to serve us. You see, many of us, if we were perfect, we would wear it as a badge of honor in the sense of, I'm better than you. Jesus uses his perfection in order to serve wildly imperfect people. How do you not love someone like that? But further, his perfection is also there so that we would be encouraged to continue to practice righteousness. In 1 John chapter 3, again, he's talking about everyone who makes a practice of sinning also practices lawlessness. Sin is lawlessness. Then you know that he appeared, Jesus, in order to take away sins, and in him there is no sin. Thus, to continue to live a life of perpetual sin where we go along and take pleasure in doing those things that are wrong is completely against everything that Jesus is. His perfection calls us to higher standards of living. And so when we think about Jesus and his perfection, and we think about why we love Jesus, well, if you just sit back and think for just a second, you love him because when you look at him, he's perfect. And his perfection absolutely astounds us, but it also saves us and teaches us and motivates us, and it secures us. Why wouldn't we love Jesus with a Savior like that?